Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tea Time History Chat Live with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell. Welcome to the British History Channel. I'm actually not quite live. I am alive. And I'm around. August is a little bit crazy. I'm in and out. But this morning, as you watch this is when I'm recording this. You still with me? I have been speaking to Clare Clinton from West Horsley Place. And anyone who's been with me the last few weeks will know that I visited West Horsley Place. And it has recently been discovered to have been not just owned by Henry VIII, but a significantly well-used home of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII famously sort of dies with a massive property portfolio. And so many places have kind of got this link to Henry VIII, but it doesn't mean that he used many of the homes he owned. However, West Horsley Place has discovered documentation which places Henry firmly at the home on a number of occasions, some very well documented and dated. He used it. Well, I'm going to let Clare tell you way more about it. It's not just a link with Henry VIII that this home has, but he owned it and used it for such a significant period that is also highly likely, although the evidence is still to be uncovered, of his wives also being with him there, potentially in 1533, July 1533, Anne Boleyn actually being there. Sorry, excuse me. 1533. Anyway, I'm going to let Clare tell you all about that. But before we get on to that, two things to let you know about. My interview with Alice Hunt, who has written this fabulous book. It's out in September 2024, certainly in the UK. If you're over in America, I think you will really enjoy this book. It's about well, as it says on the book, Britain's revolutionary decade, 1649 to 1660, the period where Britain had no monarch, and is supposedly a republic. And it's it's complex, but in a very, very interesting way. Don't let that put you off. It's it throws up lots of interesting questions about rule and what happens when the sort of established system is overturned and what happens next. And Alice has gone into this in brilliant detail. The actual book goes through year by year from 1649 to 1660. Apparently in the US, it's not necessarily going to be available. So if you want to get hold of a copy, I think you might have to sort of get onto the UK Amazon site and get one, but I think you're going to love it. If you're not sure, watch the interview that I have done with Alice. It is now available on YouTube. So that's youtube.com/British History. And it's also available on the British History podcast as well, if you like to grab your Tea Time Chat Live and your historian interviews from me on the go. Yeah, have a listen to that. And of course, if you're a member of my Patreon, there's an extended version where she answers some of the questions that all the questions that my patrons put forward. Also, I am going off to Bosworth this weekend. It's the Bosworth Medieval Festival, which commemorates the Battle of Bosworth, which happened on the 22nd of August, 1485, when, of course, Henry Tudor becomes King of England by virtue of beating the incumbent king, Richard III. And I am going off there. One, I've never been to the festival, so that's going to be great. But I'm going specifically to hear speak and then interview Nathan Armin, his latest book. And yes, these are all my post-it notes. If anyone listening on the podcast, the book is now just fanned out with pink post-it notes, which faded in the sun because I actually got some sunshine. I've been away for a couple of weeks. I actually got some sunshine in the south of England. It was lovely. But Nathan's newest book, it's only just been published, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor, I've read it all, as you can see from my post-its. This is kind of my idea, my way of summarizing a book so that I can then go and interview the the author, which I will be doing on Saturday, as I say, at Bosworth. I'm going to go and see Nathan speak. I am going to be interviewing Nathan. Again, members of my Patreon, which is patreon.com/British history, by the way, if you're not already on there, have had the opportunity to ask or put forward a question for me to ask Nathan. Now, if you'd like to do that, you have till the end of tomorrow, Thursday the 15th, to go over to Patreon, join if you're not already joined, and put your question in there in the comments, and I will take it to Nathan when I see him on the weekend. Just a little heads up, if you are new to Patreon, if you join ASAP, there's no issue. But if you want to join in future, please always join via the desktop, via your computer. If you try and join via your phone and use Apple Pay, Apple is now whacking on a 30% charge, which is ridiculous. You don't have to pay that if you join in a different way, and obviously then once you've joined you can access it via your phone, no problem. So that's just a heads up. So because I would love to see you over there on patreon.com/British history. There's lots on there. Just asking questions of historians and then seeing the extended interview is just one thing. We have a historical book club. Our next one is coming up on the 8th of September, where we will be discussing Helen Carr's book about John of Gaunt, The Red Prince. Really looking forward to that. It's my second time of reading the book and I am enjoying it just as much as the first time. So all that being said, right now I'm going to introduce you to Clare and get to talk about the history of this fascinating home, West Horsley Place. Clare, welcome to the British History Channel. We met in person at your wonderful workplace. I mean, what a place to work, West Horsley Place, a few weeks ago. So I have sort of introduced people to West Horsley Place a bit on the channel, but I'm really grateful for you to come and speak to us today. So can you
thanks for having us.
Yeah, well, can you just first of all explain who you are and what your position is at West Horsley Place?
Of course, yes. So I'm Clare Clinton and I am the Arts, Heritage and Learning Manager, which boils down to sort of creating our public programme of activities and coming up with ways, hopefully sort of fun and accessible ways that our visitors and our community can access the amazing history and heritage and that we've got at West Horsley Place.
So I have admitted to people who've been listening to this for a while, when I first came across West Horsley Place, that I hadn't heard of you. And, you know, well, we'll get into it, but it turns out you're a place with significant history and linked to one of the most famous, famous characters out of British history, of course, Henry VIII, which we'll get into. And actually, that was my introduction to you. I was on tour and one of the speakers, Professor James Clark, said, "Have you heard of West Horsley Place?" And I was like, "No," thinking, should I admit to not having heard of you? You know?
No, I know what you mean. Yeah. It has been, we are a bit of a secret, I guess, is the way you'd probably phrase it, because the house was still privately lived in right up until 2014, that the last owner occupier, who was a lady called Mary, Duchess of Roxburgh, died. And she left the house to her great nephew Bamber Gascoigne, expecting that he would sell it. And he and his wife, with amazing vision and generosity, decided, instead of selling it, to create a charity and open it to the public. But it was in totally private hands before that. So, starting a brand new, as it were, very old but new heritage site, a new charity, from nothing. It really takes a while to build up steam and for people to find out that you're there. Absolutely. So that's been a big challenge for us and still is.
Yes. I also imagine the uncovering the history in the house must be something that's coming maybe thick and fast, is it? Or, I suppose it takes a lot of work though to uncover it.
Yeah. And it's again, it's another challenging area because we're a very small charity and a small team. So unlike some of the bigger heritage charities or the national charities, we don't have in-house curators. We don't sort of have in-house research capabilities, really. But the charity being founded by Bamber Gascoigne, a very passionate historian, history and heritage was always going to be really at the heart of what we want to deliver here as an experience for people. But the mission to actually delve into the history of this place and find out what it was has been, one of the big things we've been trying to do since we opened up. And it continues to be so. So you mentioned, that the house has a quite remarkable history. And I mean, we didn't really know that really until last year. So when you mentioned James Clark, he is a history professor at the University of Exeter and has done a lot of research around the Courtenay family and the Courtenay family papers, who are obviously the Earls of Devon and based down there at Powdron Castle. And he got in touch with us last year because the Courtenays owned West Horsley Place from 1533 to 1538, and suggested a partnership looking into that interesting period. And we were desperate to do that because we'd always known, for example, that Henry VIII owned West Horsley Place a couple of different times over his reign. But as you know very well, he owned a lot of places. It didn't mean he was even ever there, or that, he'd ever visited, or that he had any kind of significant impact on the house at all. So although it's something we've always told visitors, we really had very little understanding of what that actually meant, or how exciting it's turned out to be.
Well, let's go into that, and then we'll talk about the rest of the history of the house as well, because it's quite vast already, that you know about already, which is fabulous. So when does it come into sort of the Henry VIII story?
Well, 1533 is the key year. So the house was owned by a guy called John Boucher, who was governor of Calais, and he died around there, 1532, 1533, owing money to the king. And as the king was wont to do, he took the house and other properties in kind of lieu of tax, I guess, basically. And he held on to it for a very short amount of time then, but he did own it briefly. And he pretty swiftly gave it, must have been around the beginning of 1533, to Henry and Gertrude Courtenay. So that is the sort of first time it touches Henry VIII. But after he'd given it to Henry and Gertrude Courtenay, who were the Marquess and Marchioness of Exeter, they invited him, or he invited himself, who knows, but he came for a stay in July of that year. So that's the first time that we know he was physically here. And what's so exciting about that, and this is why James Clark got in touch with us, is that the menu exists from that visit, which it's quite rare apparently to find a surviving sort of Tudor banquet menu away from a royal household, as it were. So we've got the menu that they ate when the king visited on the 29th of July, 1533. And we've also got a pretty good idea about who was here, and a pretty good idea about how they would have been spending their time during the visit. And the Courtenays themselves, the hosts, are a really fascinating sort of power couple, just sort of treading on the edge of the king's love on one hand and sort of dangerously close to treason on the other hand. So we found this amazing kind of story all centered around Henry VIII that we just didn't know about.
Because of course, so as I understand it, the Courtenays they're not overly keen on Henry's split from Rome, him putting himself at the head of the church. And this is why you say maybe they were invited, maybe they invited him, maybe Henry invited himself. Was he there to keep an eye?
That's it.
What's the background to that dinner?
Was he just there because he married Anne Boleyn the month before? She was quite heavily pregnant, so that they weren't straying far from Greenwich, or which I think is where she gave birth in the end. But they'd been in Windsor the week before, and he was obviously looking for some sort of good hunting. So it could have been that he was just here because, you know, this was not a formal progress visit. This was a visit to some relatively intimate sort of friends, might be a bit strong, but sort of connections of his. His relationship with Henry Courtenay is a really interesting one, because at this stage in their relationship, the king was very fond of Henry Courtenay. He almost viewed him like a younger brother. And they were both very sporting. So Courtenay had been top of the lists at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, you know, was the sort of English champion jouster. They enjoyed hunting together. You know, Courtenay was very good looking and fashionable and young and athletic. And I think perhaps in lots of ways, perhaps the king maybe saw a bit of a reflection of himself there. But he was the king's first cousin. So he's one of those dangerous sort of Plantagenet blooded people who are in a very tricky position when they're close to the crown. So it could have been that the king just wanted to stop in somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he could have a sort of intimate visit, not a big formal sort of court visit. We know Cromwell was here, which is interesting. So that makes me think that maybe, yes, he did just want to stop in with some dear friends, but that also maybe he was testing their loyalty a little bit. And I think, I mean, you know much more about Henry VIII, and was ever straightforward that perhaps there was always a kind of like underlayer of a different motive, or there was a very nuanced approach to how he did everything. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was here both to enjoy some good hunting, but also just kind of test their loyalties, because they had been very sort of fervent papists, as it were. And Gertrude had been a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon for a long time. So they weren't embracing the reforms that were sort of coming down the track, that was for sure. And in fact, Gertrude Courtenay had a bit of a tangle with Elizabeth Barton, the Maid of Kent. I don't know if you knew about that, but so she went down to Canterbury to visit the Maid of Kent and hear some of her prophecies. And she took her serving maid Constance with her, and apparently they swapped outfits so that Gertrude sort of could go in disguise and Constance would be dressed as the sort of noble lady. So she obviously knew that it was a bit of a, you know, she obviously felt the subterfuge was necessary. So she must have known that, you know, the Maid of Kent was a controversial figure, and that her being there may displease the king, or, you know. So I don't know exactly when Elizabeth Barton started sort of delivering the very anti-Anne Boleyn, very anti-Henry VIII kind of visions that she was famous for having. But Elizabeth Barton Gertrude Courtenay actually invited Elizabeth Barton back here to West Horsley Place. So she was actually a visitor here in the same year that the king then later visited. So it could only have been a couple of months apart.
Wow.
And I think that's really interesting, because I think the king would have been wondering if he could trust them.
Elizabeth Barton, of course, prophesies the sort of downfall of Henry, and he was eventually attainted for treason. I think she was attainted, isn't she? There's no trial, for treason and executed. So yeah, it's very serious.
Really serious, yeah. And Gertrude Courtenay, actually, there are letters that are still existing that she wrote to Cromwell, basically sort of trying to beg forgiveness for having been so silly as to have any doings with Elizabeth Barton, and I'm just an ignorant woman. So many people have been taken in by her. You couldn't expect me to know any better than all these other people who are much cleverer than I am, which tells us two things. One, sort of how clever Gertrude Courtenay was, because she was actually, I've forgotten the name of her father, but she was the daughter of a very renowned, very well-educated sort of scholarly family, and she'd been tutored by Erasmus, no less. So she was one of the most brilliantly bright and educated women you'd find at the court of Henry VIII. And there she was, pretending, doing the old, oh, silly me sort of routine, to just try and keep her skin. You just kind of think, God, how depressing that is.
Useful though. useful.
Yes,
useful to get out.
exactly. So she knew what she had to do to kind of try and stay alive. But two, you know, it shows you that she knew she was skating dangerously close to trouble by having that relationship. And it's very interesting that she would take that risk, I think. So when the king visits a few months later, there are a lot of what's the right word? There are a lot of sort of different desires, different agendas at play, music making, and they're having this wonderful feast. But they're also, I think, just sort of prodding each other's boundaries and loyalties. And so it's a fascinating
undertones
moment.
of testing the waters and
exactly. But of course the king is just about as happy as you'd ever find him in his story. You know, he's finally married Anne Boleyn. She's expecting the longed for child. So that was really exciting for us as a heritage charity as well, because for most people, they'll all know who you mean when you say Henry VIII, which is great. It's a really accessible kind of figure. It's a well-known name. But, you know, if you asked any kid, they'll think about the enormous, incredibly terrifying, grumpy old man is kind of how, weirdly, is kind of the vision of him that we've been left with as a nation. And of course, really, that was only his very last few years that was the case. So when he was here in 1533, he was still very athletic, very happy. You know, I'm not saying that he was a model of sort of he's definitely no saint at any point, as we know. But he's not perhaps at that point quite the Henry that people are used to thinking about or used to meeting. And that was interesting for us as an organisation as well.
So other than feasting and avoiding the elephant in the room, as it were, while they were there, what else were they? Yes, don't say the word none. What else were they doing?
So it was really all about hunting. And what's so interesting that doing this research, so we had, I should say, once James Clark approached us, it started this project. So we were partnering with James at University of Exeter, and also with Powderham Castle, which is, you know, a wonderful place about 15 minutes away from Exeter and still the home of the Courtenay family. And the fourth partner was Historic Royal Palaces, because they have an amazing project ongoing called Henry on Tour about Henry VIII's progresses around the country. And we were working very closely with Anthony Musson, who's the head of research for HRP. So we started this project called Hosting Henry VIII, and it gave us research through Anthony and through James, access to their research into Henry VIII and West Horsley Place and the Courtenay family and their tenure at West Horsley Place. So that was an amazing gift for us as a very small heritage charity to have access to kind of historians who were that brilliant and that passionate and knowledgeable. So they found out that they all had, the Courtenays, that is Henry and Gertrude and their young son Edward, they all had matching green hunting outfits, if you can imagine that. And I was fascinated by that, because in my ignorance, I didn't realise that women were particularly involved in hunting. I guess it's not an image you're so familiar with seeing when you see sort of Tudor dramas on television or whatever. But apparently Gertrude was an amazing huntress, I guess is the word. So they did a lot of hunting when they were here, on horseback, and also sort of driven, I think is the right phrase, driven hunting. So that would have taken up kind of the vast amount of their time. So we have that episode in 1533 where the king comes to visit. Sadly, the Courtenay story then goes rapidly downhill, because they're high in the king's favour at that point, although we know there's this undercurrent that we've talked about. But after Anne Boleyn's downfall from 1536 onwards, they fall rapidly out of favour. James Clark spoke to us about the fact that perhaps Henry Courtenay as Marquis of Exeter hadn't been quite as fast as the king would have liked in implementing the dissolution of the monasteries down there. And as we know, his sympathies were firmly sort of papist rather than reformist, so that might explain it. But essentially, they got wrapped up into what's gone down in history as the Exeter conspiracy, although it's unlikely that the Exeters really had anything to do with it. And that involved a so-called conspiracy with Reginald Pole and other. Well, you'll know more about this than I do, Philippa, but they got sort of dragged by Cromwell, one imagines, into this sort of conspiracy. Or accused of being involved in this conspiracy, and put in the Tower. And Henry Courtenay was executed in very early 1538. Gertrude stayed in the Tower but managed to not get executed, and she was released. I think she was released much later on. So she was part of Queen Mary's court, but their son was kept in the Tower for ages and had a terrible time. So the Courtenays were arrested here in 1538, and at that point, or after the execution, the king took ownership of West Horsley Place back again. And then he kept it right through until just a few days before his death in 1547. So his kind of real chapter at West Horsley Place continued through his ownership, which we, thanks to access to the research, we now know that he was here at least 2 or 3 times during that period. That actually a privy council was held here in 1545, which is really exciting for us. We've got records of the changes, additions, alterations he made to the house. Some accounts survive from the king's gardens here. So we know a bit about what sort of the gardens were like and what they were spending money on in the gardens. But the house itself has altered so much since then. So it's still the same house. So the building I'm sitting in now dates from 1425 to about 1510 as the main sort of building phase. There have been earlier buildings on the site before that, but essentially the house has developed organically since sort of 1425. So although it's the same building that's standing, it's now got a lot of different decorative styles. It had a new facade sort of whacked on the front of it. So it's really hard to recognise that Tudor core, at the heart of the building. And it's really hard to imagine what it would have been like when Henry VIII owned it. But for us, just the big flashing headline is that West Horsley Place is a forgotten Tudor royal residence, which we just had no idea about. And because the house now is in a very sad state, it's on the at-risk register. Having that kind of importance in its past, having that kind of major story as a royal residence, we passionately hope will help us save it, will make it easier for us to access funding to save it, but also makes it a more exciting place for the community to come and visit and touch that history.
And before we leave today, I'll get you to let people know how they can support you in terms of visiting, but also in terms of the charity. We'll definitely get back to that. So you mentioned there about the records show what alterations Henry made. I mean, in and of itself, that shows that he cares about this place, that he's using this place, which is amazing. So do you know what sort of things what sort of alterations was he making to the building?
So it was things like we know he had his own sort of bedchamber here because he made alterations to one of the oldest wings. He put in a corridor, I think probably to give him a bit more privacy in that main bedchamber of his. He had some work done to create a wardrobe, which obviously would have been very important for him traveling. There were improvements done to the stables, which I guess is telling as well, because with the king in residence, you're going to need just bigger everything, more of everything. So I'd imagine the stables before that just weren't, capable of taking on the sort of capacity that they would need when the king was here. And And we know at that point there was a hawking tower that's listed. So in 1538, when Henry VIII, after he'd executed Henry Courtenay, an inventory was made at West Horsley Place, which is a really fascinating document that's, again, still exists, that we've been able to access through these academic partners we've had. So we know that we know the name of every servant who was working here and their physical description and what their jobs were, which is amazing. But we also know there was a chapel at that point, there was a hawking tower, and there were a lot of rooms that we now can't identify. It's still the same building, but it has changed shape quite a lot since then. So we think at that period it would have been at its biggest expanse, which makes sense when it's, in the ownership of the king and he was coming. So he didn't make huge alterations. He didn't sort of add a whole new wing anywhere, but he obviously was here enough that he wanted to make sure the place was comfortable for him and suited his needs and had appropriate stabling. And they obviously spent, well, but they did spend a bit of money in the gardens. So that aspect was clearly important as well. So you get the sense that this was a kind of like a pleasure stop, hunting, being in the garden, a comfortable place to sleep, but not a big enough manor house that you could have a large retinue here. So one imagines he'd be stopping in for, hunting visits or small scale sort of intimate parties.
Somewhere to retreat to, perhaps.
Yes, I think so. But there's still a lot for us to find out, and we're going to be continuing to collaborate with Professors Clarke and Musson and our sort of partners at Historic Royal Palaces to keep digging and finding out more. But the culmination of the Hosting Henry VIII project this year has been, as you know, a massive Hosting Henry VIII festival week that we've just had at West Horsley Place, which was really, really wonderful. So, but there is still more to find out. Definitely, the digging hasn't finished.
It's really exciting because the Tudors' tale, and especially Henry VIII, I suppose, it's been told so many times that to have something that is new is really exciting, because also, it means he was in a place that we didn't know he was in beforehand.
Yes.
So how many times was he at West Horsley Place? For how long? Who was he meeting with? What were they talking about? I mean, how much can be discovered is obviously probably nowhere near as much as we would love to be able to be discovered. But all that kind of thing. I must put into context, actually, how far away, let's say, from London are you? So from Henry's main royal palaces in London.
Yeah, so we're only about, I think it's about 20-25 miles outside from the centre of London. So from Hampton Court, we'd be like an easy ride. The other thing that I'm really excited, I hope we can find out more about, is which of his wives were here with him. We have got reason to suspect that Anne Boleyn was here for the 1533 visit. Our academic partners have been sort of toing and umming and ahhing about whether she was or whether she wasn't. The initial thought was that because she was heavily pregnant and she was, it was only a few weeks later that she went into her sort of confinement period, that they thought the likelihood was that she wouldn't have been here. But she had been on the road with Henry the week before at Windsor. And just in the last couple of weeks, Anthony Musson has found some accounts from a saddlery for the commission of a very fine lady's side saddle that coincides with the journey. So he thinks that could be a hint that actually she was here and did come. So there's a bit of a mystery there, but she may have been here with the king in 1533. And he was here again just before Christmas in, it was either 1540 or 1541. I think 1541. So there's a chance there that perhaps Catherine Howard was here. And then the Privy Council that was held in 1545 was chaired by Catherine Parr's brother. So there's a good chance that she would have been here as well. And it's so exciting. I think because all, the wives are such fascinating figures. And I don't know about you, but I just went to see the National Portrait Gallery exhibition at the weekend. So they're firmly sort of in the front of my thinking this week. But it would be wonderful for us if we could find that, any of them had been here, or why, or and then delve down into sort of what was happening at their lives in that point, or what was happening in their marriage with the king. So yes, it would be really exciting for us if they were here as well, because then it's not just a kind of like stop in and hunt place. There's a deeper layer of kind of attachment to it. But having a Privy Council here makes me think that actually there was a slightly deeper attachment to the place than just somewhere to stop in hunting. But we still got a lot more digging to do, that's for sure.
It's very exciting knowing that there's new stuff to be found. Really, really, really exciting. Yeah. Do you know, just out of interest in how, what they were spending on the garden? Is this sort of formal gardens, or is it, because he's very much into his sort of medicines and stuff? Is he growing herbs and
what is listed includes a knot garden, that strawberry borders, so growing strawberries particularly is noted, and a mount garden, which I think that they've recreated a mount garden maybe at Hampton Court. So the gardens were obviously quite important, and had I can't recall the exact sums off the top of my head, but we can certainly share that information with you. But we're obviously quite fine, to create a mount garden here. They must have been in some use. So I think that's really interesting. And what we'd love to know, and we don't know, sadly, is where those gardens were. Because the current house, the house is still the same, although it's been refronted and it's got lots of different sort of decorative styles inside now that hide how old it is. But the layout of the gardens that we have now is firmly 18th century. So it's now a walled garden laid out around 1710. We've got something like 2 kilometers of these beautiful red brick walls, including actually a serpentine wall, which is the sort of curly whirly, crinkle crankle type wall. That's it's absolutely gorgeous, but it gives us no indication of where the king's gardens would have been.
Right.
We have over the years scraped together a little bit of funding to do a geophysics sort of survey of the garden to see if we can identify any older structures under the surface, and haven't had any luck so far. So I think there's a big future project there for us if we can put together some funding, and if the public are interested in kind of finding those hidden, Henry VIII royal gardens and working out where they were. And we're pretty sure the house had a moat as well. And we don't know exactly when that disappeared, but the likelihood is that the moat would still have been in place when the king owned the house. So we'd love to know where. I mean, it sounds silly, we don't know where the moat is, we've lost it, but there's no evidence of it outside the house anymore. So there are just fascinating sort of research projects we'd love to do, to find out about. I mean, that's just one small period of the history of the house here. It's got a history that dates right back to the Saxon period. So there's a huge amount of history for us to explore. But Henry VIII was certainly the only monarch that's owned West Horsley Place, and as a relatively sort of humble country manor house, that's a massively important story for us for obvious reasons. To have a monarch not only own the place but visit it, on several occasions, if not more, is very exciting. But our Tudor sort of past seems to be a particular sort of zenith in terms of the importance nationally of the house, because Elizabeth I visited at least 4, maybe 5 times here as well, which is amazing. Again, considering it's not a hugely important, massive house, this, but the Anthony Browne, who Henry VIII gave the house to Anthony Browne just before he died. And Anthony Browne was married to Elizabeth Fitzgerald. And Elizabeth Fitzgerald, by the way, is the inspiration for the earliest sonnet ever written in the English language. She was so beautiful, apparently, that she inspired Henry Howard to write this sonnet about her. It's called The Fair Geraldine. Anyway, when Anthony Browne died, she, as her widow's jointure, was given the right to live at West Horsley Place for the rest of her life. She then went on to marry Edward Clinton, who became the Earl of Lincoln and was Elizabeth I's Lord High Admiral. But it's really interesting. There's a fantastic book by Tracy Borman about Elizabeth I called Elizabeth's Women, I think it's called. But she describes Elizabeth Fitzgerald as the Queen's really only proper female friend, which is incredibly sad. So their friendship developed because Elizabeth Fitzgerald was educated with the young Princess Elizabeth at court. And that happened because she was the daughter of a rebel Irish earl and was sort of brought up at court as a ward, for her family's good behaviour, which I don't think really worked out very well. I'm pretty sure her father and brothers were in and out of the tower all the time. But that's how the two young Elizabeths sort of made their friendship. And because of that friendship as young women and children, and also the connection to Lord Clinton, who became Queen Elizabeth's Lord High Admiral, that double connection meant that Elizabeth I was here quite a lot, or relatively a lot. And her first visit was in 1559, so just a year after she'd, come to the throne. She's still young, she's beautiful, in love with Robert Dudley, and they were here for a week, and it's a really well documented visit. Thomas Cawarden brought all the stages and sort of costumes and things like that down from the Department of Masks and Revels, I think it was called. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So they had their big warehouse at Blackfriars, and he brought all these stage scenery and temporary theatre and costumes down the river to Blackfriars to Hampton Court. And then it all came overland from Hampton Court to West Horsley Place. And they built a temporary theatre in the garden and had a week of masks and dancing and entertainment. And we even know which masks were performed.
Oh, wow.
There was one called Shipmen and another one called Maids of the Country. So we know that Robert Dudley was here. And again, it was a formal court visit, but not an enormous one. But she was here for 7 days at that point. And I love thinking about that visit because I think it's such a special moment in the story of Elizabeth I, as a very young queen, finding her feet, working out who she can trust, falling in love. So yes, our Elizabeth I is another monarch. She never owned West Horsley Place, but we'd love to know more about her later visits and actually find out exactly how many times she did come, and more about what happened when she was here and how long she was here for.
It seems like it just seems it can't have not been quite a significant place in their well, I don't know if it's the political side of it, but certainly sort of their emotional, I don't know, they've got an emotional connection to the house, it seems. I mean, a week-long visit by the Queen within her first sort of year of being Queen means it must have been somewhere, one that she maybe was already familiar with, or maybe, like you said, the people who are living here, but that it's somewhere she wants to come, and she knows it's going to sort of satisfy her needs for a week because she can, I don't know, relax. I mean, of course, she was a big fan of hunting and as well. So
I think it's this exact week. Actually, I think it's something like, I have to check, but I think it's August the 11th she arrived. So it's this exact week. You do the maths, Philippa. I'm not very good at it, but 400 and something years ago that she would have been here. So yeah, I think it's that special friendship between the two women that brought her here. And for me, I think that's particularly interesting because, as you'll know, just the remarkable stories of women in our heritage sites, at houses like this. They are stories that just haven't been told or explored or recorded in the same way as the masters of the house. And at West Horsley Place, through the centuries, there are a series of amazingly interesting women. And Elizabeth Fitzgerald is certainly one of them. And she's one we'd love to know more about, especially her friendship with the Queen and what that looked like. We do know when the Armada crisis happened. So she married Lord Clinton. She had a second marriage. She outlived him as well. So she was a widow by the time of the Armada crisis. And a letter exists, I think it's in the Surrey History Centre, and this is not verbatim. This is me sort of giving it my own spin, but essentially there's this letter from Elizabeth Fitzgerald to Lord Moore, who had recently built Loseley House, which is another beautiful Tudor house, only about 10 minutes away from us. And she wrote to Lord Moore saying, dear Lord Moore, should the Spanish get to West Horsley, will you come and defend us? And you just think, isn't that amazing? Like how real it makes it feel. Should the Spanish get to West Horsley, that threat felt that real, that she was writing to local neighbours to help her, defend the property, defend the estate, defend her, her community, her village, her servants. Should the Spanish come and invade, it just really brings it to life. But it also makes me think, there's a strong woman. She's not thinking like, oh my goodness, how am I going to, I'm going to roll over here, or I'll immediately like open my gates and give up. She's thinking, right, what support can I find? How can I make sure everybody's okay if the worst happens? She's planning, but. A fascinating woman, really fascinating, and we'd love to know more about her as well.
I think women's history tends to get, or has been, I don't want to say lost, but less focused on, because it's kind of the social history. And I think social history generally is not being in the focus as much as political history, which of course has been mainly dominated by men, and that's the stuff that gets written down and recorded. But that makes these relationships no less powerful than those political ones at all. In fact, I think in some instances you could argue that they were more powerful, more influential. These links. Just recently, Dr. Joanne Paul has written a book about the Dudley family, House of Dudley, and through that book, the female relationships sort of come out into the story as being on two occasions, I think, the reason that the Dudley family kind of existed beyond, for further into the future, because they got themselves into a lot of trouble, and the women came up to kind of manage that. It's so
it's fascinating. It's really fascinating, especially when we think about for Queen Elizabeth, in a world where who could she trust? Lonely is the head that wears the crown, or whatever the quote is. Like, it's lonely at the top, but you're very isolated. She didn't have a lot of female friends. Like, some of the women, or a lot of the women at court, was sort of competition in some way. She didn't welcome sort of wives generally to court. So for her to have this strong friendship with Elizabeth Fitzgerald, I think it's important. I think it's really important. And I think I'd love to have been like a fly on the wall about, how much of a sort of confidant was Elizabeth Fitzgerald to the Queen, and how involved was she in what the Queen was thinking or doing, or how much might the Queen have divulged or trusted her. It's really, really interesting. So yes, it's another area where we need to find out more. There's a big story there. I just know there is.
We need an army of researchers, because
I know,
there's so many stories.
That's what we need. That's what we need.
You mentioned obviously Anthony Browne there, and obviously Geraldine, as she's become known. Now you have a feature in the house linked to Anthony Browne, don't you? And it's really tell us about that, because it's
well, it's It's really remarkable, and hopefully all your viewers and listeners will come and visit us after this, and they can see it. But we have a ceiling in the house called the Geraldine ceiling. It's named after Elizabeth Fitzgerald, and it is the oldest decorative plasterwork ceiling in the country, and it dates from that 1 year when Anthony Browne owned the house before he died. So the king gave the house to Anthony Browne in 1547. Anthony Browne then sadly died in 1548. And this ceiling is decorated with his initials and with his wife Elizabeth's initials, so AB and EB all over the ceiling. But so it's got plaster armorial badges, it's got plaster animals, it's painted, it's really beautiful, but it's really the only room in the house where you are transported straight back to that period in our Tudor history, because it has exposed timber work, it has the original paneling is still in the room. So it's really the house where the room in the house where you get the most sense of that Tudor period. Hugely sadly, what we have left is actually only a fragment of what was there. So the Geraldine room is now a little separate room by the side of our drawing room, but at an earlier point, we don't know exactly when, it would have just been an integral part of the drawing room. And the drawing room would have been the great chamber. So we had a hall below and the great chamber above. And this ceiling, we know, stretched all the way across the whole of the great chamber. So it would have been something like 40 feet long. And we know it was there right up until at least 1730. Because there's a diagram in the British Museum showing it still in place. But at some point, 10, 20 years after that, a sort of neoclassical decorative scheme was put in downstairs and up the stairs, and they replaced it with a plain white plaster ceiling across the door.
So plain as. Yeah.
How could they? How could they? But at least we have the plan showing how it used to be, and we still have the portion of it that's in the Geraldine room, which is a small little room, but really, really staggeringly beautiful. It's definitely, I'm sure it's one of the reasons the house is grade 1 listed, because it's such an important ceiling. Excuse me. As you know, the house is on the at-risk register, and it needs a huge amount of conservation and repair work done to save it, basically. And the Geraldine ceiling was in a very poor state of repair. So much so that for the last 5 years, we've had it not propped up, but we've had some sort of acro props underneath it with padding, so that if it did move, there was some cushioning there to sort of, support it. And we raised £80,000, which we were successful in finally doing this year. And we've had the conservation and repair work done to it just in the last 2 months. So there's actually right now upstairs an expert historical painter filling in where the new repairs have been made. So it will look as good as it's ever looked in a couple of weeks. And that the scaffolding is out, so it's standing by itself. So we can't wait for people to see that.
Yes.
Because that's the first time in at least 5 years that visitors, any of us will have been able to enjoy it without having a whole pile of scaffolding underneath it.
Yes, because when I came, obviously you had the scaffolding. Yes. Oh, well, that's.
Oh, you'll have to come back. You have to come back and see it again.
I would love to. So, now, so we've got Henry VIII, we've got Elizabeth I. Now there is somebody else, sort of, who straddles the. I mean, to be fair, I mean, we're going to have to do more of these, because especially as you uncover more history, I would love to have you back and us talk even more.
Yeah.
But there is someone who straddles the Tudor into the Stuart period, who had quite a significant impact on the look of the building. So let's talk about them. Let's talk about the Raleighs.
Let's talk about the Raleigh family. Absolutely. So one of the other kind of remarkable objects that we have at West Horsley Place is this bag.
I meant to ask you about this when I was with you and I forgot.
Did you see the bag when you were here?
No, I didn't.
Oh,
And
no.
I was driving away.
You have to come back.
Yes,
your listeners are now thinking, why is she banging on about a bag? What's that got to do with the Raleigh family? So let me tell you, Walter Raleigh, of course, as we all know, was finally executed, bless him, poor man, in 1618. So he'd been high and very low in favour with Queen Elizabeth, in and out of the Tower, and eventually executed by James I in 1618. And he was married to a woman called Elizabeth, or Bess, Bess Throckmorton, who became Bess Raleigh, another amazingly interesting woman. But she was clearly a little bit, well, I can't work out if she was just madly in love with her husband, which she clearly was, or literally just mad, because she I don't know how she did it, but she managed to retain his head after the execution. So, as things normally go with a Tudor execution, your family get nothing. Your lands are taken, your body is taken. They don't get the clothes from your back. They don't get to bury you. They are left with none of you, nothing. So somehow Bess seems to have been able to pay off the headsman to give her Walter's head. And she had this elaborately beautiful red velvet bag made, popped the head into it, and carried the bag just sort of tied to her skirts around with her wherever she went every day for the next 29 years until she died. And we've got the bag. The bag is still here in the house. And it's a crazy story because this head-shaped red bag, had been hanging by the fireplace in the drawing room for as long as anyone can remember. There are photos of it there from the 1930s, in country life. And when the Duchess died in 2014, a lot of the very valuable furniture and things like that were auctioned. And the bag was still hanging by the fireplace. No one sort of gave the bag a second look. We all knew the story about Walter Raleigh and Bess, which I'll come on to, but nobody, I don't know why, but I guess it just never occurred to anybody that the bag that was there could still be the original bag. I think we had assumed as a charity when we took over the property that it was a kind of like a replica to enable us to tell the story of Bess and Walter's head, or that it was just coincidence, or that it was for something else entirely. But when the 400th anniversary of Walter Raleigh's execution rolled around in 2018, we had a call from the historic costume experts who delivered the live interpretation at the Tower of London. And they called us and they said, we're going to do the life and death of Walter Raleigh. Can we come have a look at the bag so we can make a copy? And we said, yes, of course, come along. And they came down to the house and very quickly told us that it dated from the early 17th century. Like, did we realize how old it was? Did we realize that this could be the authentic bag? In fact, the likelihood was that it was the bag, and we had absolutely no idea. It was amazing. You've got to come and see it. I'll send you some photos of it as well. But
yes,
it is head shaped, if you could believe that. And it's red velvet bag. It's got like gold tassels on it. So it would have been, a pretty bling piece of accessorizing, but I'm not sure that I would want to carry my husband's head around in it, however pretty it is.
No,
So
I don't think it remains
we've got the bag. Yes. So after Bess died, and she's another fascinating woman, she fought tooth and nail to get her children's rights back after Walter's execution, and she was successful in doing that, which is remarkable. But after her death, Carew Raleigh was the name of their son, and he was actually born in the Tower of London, and he owned West Horsley Place at that point by the time Bess died. And it was Carew Raleigh who built the red brick facade that's on the front of the house. He was obviously a young, fashionable man about town and wanted to live somewhere that looked fashionable, but didn't have, luckily for us, quite enough money just to knock the whole place down and build something brand new made of brick. So what he did was build this red brick facade along the front. It's actually a freestanding wall. It's barely connected to the house, which is a bit of a problem because it's always trying to lean away.
Yeah.
But he built this red brick facade. It's got Dutch gables, so it's in the latest, fashion. It's not dissimilar from the Queen's house at Kew, if any of your listeners know that building. And he built a brand new staircase inside the house. So he was obviously trying to modernize and sort of aggrandize the place. And after his mother's death, apparently he buried Sir Walter's head under the stairs here. And then once he died in 1664, I think it was, something like that, he was buried at St Mary's Church, which is just at the bottom of our driveway. And the head was reburied with him in the church, is how the story goes. But there's been no sort of archaeological investigation in the church. The last time it was actually sort of recorded as being seen was in 1703 when Penelope Nicholas, who was then the lady of the house, got killed by a chimney falling down on her in the night. There's a whole other story. But when she was buried at the church, they opened the grave and it was recorded that, Walter's head was still there. So for the 400th anniversary, St Margaret's in Westminster, which is, as you know, an amazing church full of amazing Tudor history, they rang us and they said, we've got the body, you've got the head. What do you want to do for the anniversary? Which was brilliant. So some people think the head is still in the house somewhere. Apparently the Duchess, who was the last lady to live here, thought that the head might still be in the house. I'm firmly in the camp that believes it's in the church. So I can't see why it wouldn't be in the church. But either way, the Raleigh family have given us one of the most sort of macabre but also exciting stories in the history of West Horsley Place, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's just reminded me about ghosts, because I've just been thinking, if you've got a head, that must surely lead to some sort of spiritual activity. But you have literally had ghosts, because people might not have heard of West Horsley Place, but they may well recognise it. Do you want to tell us quickly about that? Because people can go and
they will know it, or a lot of people know it as Button House from Ghosts. So not only are we surrounded, I imagine, by real ghosts, there must be a lot of them, including Walter Raleigh's head floating around. We've been surrounded physically by the brilliant BBC ghosts for the last 6-7 years. They've been filming in total. They finished the last series, which was series 5 last year, but it's become a phenomenon, the series. So I'd highly recommend it if any of your followers haven't watched Ghost. It's on iPlayer. It's brilliant. It's so funny. It's a sort of old-fashioned family appropriate comedy, but it's absolutely brilliant. And the premise is that a young couple move into Button House, which is West Horsley Place. And the wife quickly discovers that she can see and talk to all the ghosts that have accumulated there over the centuries. And it's very warm-hearted and inclusive and very witty and brilliantly performed by all the actors who are in it. So we loved having them filming here. We've done quite a number of really brilliant filming jobs over the last 6 or 7 years. In COVID, of course, that was all we really could do to keep income coming in because it couldn't be open to the public. But Ghosts is the one that the public have really taken to their hearts. And we love it as a show as well, because some of our real history has actually made it into the script. They talk about Henry VIII having lunch in a particular room, which of course he did. I feel like maybe the character Headless Humphrey might have been inspired a little bit by the story of Walter Raleigh and his head, So it's a gorgeous show, but it's brought us this amazing, it's raised huge amounts of awareness for West Horsley Place. So we get visitors coming from all over the country and from other countries because they love ghosts, which is brilliant for us. Because it all helps to put us on the map, and hopefully they'll arrive wanting to see Button House and see all their favourite places where the show has been shot, and they'll leave having enjoyed all that, but also knowing that actually the house is really called West Horsley Place, and that it is a place that needs saving and helping, and a community, and that they'll stay and help us and be involved with, you know, keeping the place going.
Fantastic. So if people do want to visit, how can they?
So the best way to visit is, we aren't open 7 days a week like a sort of National Trust property, but we do have events. Sorry, so I'm just going in and out of my office. Apologies, one of our volunteers. We do have events happening almost every day, and there are lots of different kinds of events. So you can come along to a traditional open day where you just have a wander around, take your time. There are lots of volunteers to talk to. But we, as a charity, specialise in heritage and culture and nature. So there are all kinds of different activities you can do, from a guided tour or a filming tour to nature walks through the estate, or concerts or exhibitions. So the best thing to do is to get onto the website, which is westhorsleyplace.org, have a look at what's on, book something particular, and then come along to that. If you just want to come and have a sort of a little cup of tea and have a look at the outside of the house and take your dog for a walk, you're always welcome to do that. You can do that anytime. The cafe's just open for anyone who wants to come along Wednesday to Sunday generally. But yeah, do come and check us out if you can. We'd love to welcome everybody.
Wonderful. And if people can't visit but want to help you with this enormous project that you've got to make sure that the roof doesn't cave in, which is an ongoing issue, how can they do that? How can they support you?
That's very kind of you to ask. So if anybody would like to, you can make a donation just on the website. I think it's on like the homepage. It's got the buttons at the top there. But also there's loads of history articles on our website. So if you're particularly interested in any of the stories we've talked about today, or any of the people we've mentioned, you can go onto the website there. And we've worked with, as well as these academics I've mentioned, we've worked with local historians and other people to try and share as many of those stories on the website as we can as well, so that if you aren't able to get here physically, you can still, you know, enjoy some of the stories associated with West Horsley Place.
Brilliant. And we're really hoping to get you into a British history tour soon.
Yes, that would be brilliant.
But also just keep in touch, because I'm fascinated, and I know everyone watching this will be, to know what you're discovering and how the story is developing and what you're uncovering, because it just sounds like there's so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
But isn't it amazing the array of places that references to the house have been found? It just shows, you know, anyone doing any kind of like research into anything, if you notice West Horsley Place pop up, you know, let you know.
Let us know. Yeah, let us know. Yeah, the history is just remarkably rich for a place that, you know, it's not a palace, it's not a castle. But when we have young visitors from our village primary school or something like that, you know, I'll say to them, right, you know, name a king or queen, and I know they won't name any of the really obscure ones, but I know whoever they do name, there'll be a story or a connection with West Horsley Place, which is just amazing. And it's had a long history of very creative and artistic people here through the centuries as well. But I think what's really special, if people are thinking about coming to visit, is because the charity is independent, and we've trod very carefully in terms of how we share West Horsley Place with people. So we think it's really special that you can come and experience the house essentially as we found it, which is a bit of a time capsule, you know. So there aren't lots of signs everywhere. It is like stepping back in time, and our approach is very much heritage without barriers. So, you know, you can pick up a book and have a sniff of it and see, you know, open a cupboard to see what's in it and explore and feel comfortable. And there aren't a lot of places, sadly, where you can do that. But this is one of the places that you can. So yeah, come see us.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh well, I loved coming down. I will take you up on your offer of coming back, because
Yes.
it was just magical. And there is something very special about the fact that it is untouched from how it's sort of
Yes.
just developed, because you can see, you know, the core history in amongst the next stage and the next stage, how it's developed over time, you know, the follow-on history, I think is the term used, and it's really enchanting. So thank you very much for having me down, and thank you for joining me today.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for inviting us. It's really, anything that helps us spread the word is brilliant, so we're very grateful.
You're more than welcome, more than welcome. Thank you everyone for joining me for this live, not actually quite live, episode of Tea Time History Chat. And I hope you enjoyed hearing all about West Horsley Place from Clare. I will be back next week, live proper at 3 p.m. and I hope to see you there. Take care, everybody. I'll see you really soon. Bye-bye.